The strange thing about human psychology is this. Most people only realize your value after access to you disappears. Not when you explain yourself, not when you fight to keep them, and definitely not when you're trying to prove how much you care. The moment people start missing you the most is often the exact moment you stop reaching for them, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why does someone who walked away suddenly start thinking about you only after you're gone? The answer has very little to do with love, and almost everything to do with how the human brain processes absence. The mistake almost everyone makes. When someone leaves us or emotionally pulls away, something instinctive activates. We try to repair the connection immediately. We send the message, we explain our feelings, we replay the relationship to friends, we check their social media, we try to stay emotionally connected in any way possible. And while this feels natural, psychologically, it creates a very specific problem. It removes uncertainty. And when uncertainty disappears, so does curiosity. The human brain is wired to chase what it cannot easily access, but when you're still emotionally available, still reacting, still explaining, still watching, your presence becomes predictable, and predictable things rarely occupy someone's thoughts for long. The psychology of absence. There's a cognitive bias known as the scarcity effect. When something becomes scarce, the brain automatically increases its perceived value. This doesn't just apply to money, products, or opportunities. It applies to people. When someone knows they can reach you at any moment, your psychological value stabilizes. But when access suddenly disappears, the brain begins to fill the gap with questions. Why did they stop contacting me? Why aren't they reacting anymore? Did they move on? Did I misjudge their importance? And these questions do something extremely powerful. They reopen a mental space that had already been closed. Your absence forces the brain to re-evaluate the story it told about you. Why silence is so disruptive. Most people think silence is passive. Psychologically, it's not. Silence is disruptive, because silence removes the emotional feedback loop the other person expects. Normally, relationships operate on a predictable pattern: action, reaction, message, response, distance, pursuit. But when the reaction disappears, the pattern breaks, and the human brain hates broken patterns, so it tries to complete the loop on its own. That's when something interesting starts happening. They start thinking about you again. Not because you're chasing them, but because their brain is trying to resolve unfinished emotional information. The hidden trap after breakups. However, this is where many people unintentionally sabotage themselves. They stop contacting the person, but they keep talking about them, to friends, to coworkers, on social media. They replay every moment of the relationship over and over. And even though the other person may not be present, psychologically, they still occupy enormous space in your identity. You may look silent on the outside, but internally, they are still the center of your emotional world, and that keeps you stuck. Real detachment isn't just behavioral, it's cognitive. It means the story of your life stops revolving around them. The shift that changes everything. Something powerful happens when attention returns to your own life. You begin rebuilding the parts of yourself that were neglected during the relationship. Your routines change, your priorities change, your emotional energy redirects. And gradually, the version of you that existed during the relationship starts to dissolve. At first, this feels uncomfortable because identity reconstruction always does. But slowly, something surprising begins to emerge. You stop measuring your value through the eyes of the person who left. Instead, you begin evaluating your life through your own direction. And that shift changes the signal you send to the world. Why growth triggers regret. People often believe regret comes from jealousy, but psychologically, regret usually comes from miscalculation. When someone leaves a relationship, they create a prediction in their mind. They imagine how the story will unfold. Maybe they assume you'll be devastated. Maybe they assume you'll wait. Maybe they assume you'll always be emotionally available if they change their mind. But when time passes and they see you thriving, living fully, laughing again, building something new, their prediction collapses. And when predictions collapse, the brain begins searching for the mistake. Did I misjudge them? Did I give up something valuable too quickly? Did I lose someone I could have grown with? That is the moment regret begins forming. Not because you tried to make them regret it, but because your life continued without needing their return. The breadcrumb test. Sometimes, after this shift happens, the person reappears. Not with a grand apology, not with deep reflection, but with something smaller. A message, a like, a casual, "How have you been?" These are often called breadcrumbs, small signals meant to test whether the emotional door is still open. And how you respond here reveals whether you've actually grown. If you immediately return to the old dynamic, the psychological pattern resets. But if your life has genuinely moved forward, something else happens. You no longer respond from longing. You respond, if you respond at all, from self-respect. And that difference is immediately noticeable. But here's the part almost no one talks about. When you truly rebuild your life, the person you become often no longer need the relationship that once felt essential. Not because you're angry, not because you're trying to prove something, but because your identity expanded beyond that chapter of your life. The version of you who once felt incomplete without them simply doesn't exist anymore. And that's when the real victory appears. Not their regret, not their return, but the realization that your happiness stopped depending on their choices. Ironically, the moment someone is most likely to miss you is often the moment you've stopped needing them to. Because once your life becomes full again, their absence stops feeling like a loss. It becomes something else entirely. Just another chapter that helped shape the person you eventually became. And that person doesn't chase validation from the past. They build something better in the future.